A year back, I released a video titled ranking every single pilot episode from worst to best. But then I thought, why stop at just the pilot episodes? Why not go a little further? So today, we won't be ranking just the pilot episodes. In fact, we're going to be ranking the pilot episodes and all of the season premieres in Ben 10 from worst to best. We'll rank every single season premiere from Season 1 of Classic to Season 8 of Omniverse. Now I'm ranking these episodes based off of just straight up how much I like them, and just the general sense of critically how good they are. And yes, two-parter episodes will count as one entry. It wouldn't really make sense just to include one episode as it kind of leaves it on a cliffhanger, and it also probably wouldn't make a difference if you just shoved it all into one episode, or you just used the first part. Plus, the title of this video does say season premieres and not strictly episode 1. Also, if it wasn't apparent already, this is full of spoilers, so if you haven't seen any of these episodes that are 10 plus years old, I'm sorry. But anyways, there's 18 season premieres to rank here, so let's not waste any more time and just jump right into it. Number 17 and 18 in the worst season premieres of the entire series both come from Omniverse, and those episodes are Clyde 5 and Catfight. Now, I don't feel a little bit of sympathy for putting these episodes at the bottom. In fact, they're so bad, I can't even figure out which one is worse. There's only one word I can use to describe these episodes. Bad. They basically have no redeemable qualities. Now let me tell you something, I was watching these season premieres while I was coming off of a string of headaches, and I thought I was getting better, but these episodes made my head melt. Let's start with Catfight. The plot of this episode is that Atea and Luma both want a husband, so they try to claim Ben. Meanwhile, Nancy Chan is doing whatever the hell she does. And it all combines into one bad blend of an episode. It's just hard to watch. I would tell you to go watch this episode to yourself to see how bad it is, but frankly, I love you guys, and I don't want you guys to experience the same thing I had to. As for Clyde 5, holy hell, this episode sucks. Here we have another case of introducing more random people into Ben's family who never return again, but have a random plot centered around them. This weirdly happens a lot. If I had said to you that Ben had 5 cousins, you wouldn't believe me, and you said that he only has 2. Going forward, the episodes get a lot better. If you want to watch these episodes yourself, be my guest, but just proceed with caution. Next up, we have Midnight Madness from Classic Series Season 3. Man, I really wish Ben 10K was the premiere and not this episode. I honestly don't really have a lot to say here. It's strikingly below average. It's a hypnosis episode where the main characters get hypnotized and start to attack each other. It's a pretty cliche topic. This episode is also not important to the story of Ben 10 at all. The episode introduces a villain called Sublimino who, you guessed it, he can hypnotize people with this little pocket watch he's got. Which I guess is kind of funny, mirroring the fact that Ben has the Omnitrix, which is a watch, and he's got a watch as well. Now yes, he does come back in the -10, but he honestly doesn't really do much there, and he doesn't even have a speaking role. I do like that Ben turns into a giant clock octopus as upgrade, and also Wildvine shows up, which is a huge plus. But the main redeeming thing that this episode does have is that Sublimino is voiced by Richard Horvitz, aka the voice for Grey Matter.
We're talking 6,532.
Invader Zim.
You'll have to move along, hideous goblin. I'm posing dramatically for when the dib shows up.
And Chaos from Skylanders.
Frozen with fear in my awesome presence.
Another Classic Series episode is up, and it is Perfect Day. This episode's pretty trippy when you watch it, and actually fakes you out quite a bit. Basically, Ben gets captured by the Forever Knights, or the organization as it's called in the Classic Series, and gets put into a dream world where he thinks he's having the best day of his life. Meanwhile, Enoch is trying to get the Omnitrix off, but since Enoch is the most incompetent person in the Forever Knights, he can't do it. His plans get thwarted by a 10-year-old. Now, there is actually a kind of interesting theory centered around this episode, similar to the Ash Coma theory in Pokemon. Basically, people are saying that the rest of the Ben 10 series is a result of Ben's perfect dream and he was actually never able to take the helmet off. But it's obviously not true. Also, how does Max just have this in his rust bucket? There's another obscure, wacky Classic Series episode with no real connection to a plot. This episode isn't particularly good, but I'll give it this. It's pretty entertaining. Next, we have the premiere to the most criticized season of Ben 10, and that is Vengeance of Vilgax from Alien Force Season 3. Now, I don't know what it was watching it this time around. Maybe I matured more, maybe I felt funny the first time watching this, maybe Vilgax went back and changed this episode, but this is not a good premiere. This is really the highest I can put it since it's somewhat important. By the time I finished part 1, all I can think of was, what did I actually just watch? The first part is Vilgax issuing the Conqueror's Challenge, and Ben and Kevin hacking the Omnitrix. But the thing is about these episodes is that so much time was spent on dumb, pointless content. Part 1 starts off with the trio fighting Serpent, and this takes a whole 10 minutes to finish for what should have just been an opening fight scene. And then in the second part, it takes Ben a whole 15 minutes for him to actually meet up with Vilgax, so 37 minutes into this premiere, Ben actually meets up with Vilgax. This two-parter is just obsessed with wasting my time. To give it a little bit of praise, I will say, the visuals are good here, and the animators definitely did not slack. It was also kind of cool seeing that Ben was able to keep his classic series transformations from War of the Worlds, and Diamond Head gets a cool scene at the end of it, so I can't really complain about that. But once you look past that, it all goes downhill. Like, why couldn't Gwen and Kevin defeat Serpent? Why did Ben think it was a good idea to hack the Omnitrix? Why didn't he listen to Azimuth when he told him not to do that? How did the aliens even escape from the Omnitrix? Why did Max decide to go fight Vilgax himself? Why is this premiere botched so hard? This actually had so much potential as a season premiere, since we haven't seen Vilgax since Secret of the Omnitrix. I don't know what I enjoyed about this premiere as a young lad, but watching it now just made me more annoyed than anything. Next up is the Secret Saturdays episode TGIS. Look, I know some people are big fans of the Secret Saturdays, but I'm not. And that's what this episode suffers from. I don't know anything about the Secret Saturdays universe, so it was pretty hard understanding some of the references in it. And yes, I have watched the Ink Tank's breakdown of this episode, so that made me understand it a little bit more. But that's still with additional help. The episode itself is alright, Dr. Anima comes back, which is a huge plus, and I like some of the characters in the Secret Saturdays universe. It's always cool seeing characters from different series in Ben 10's art style. The Saturdays work well in the Ben 10 universe, and they're pretty fun characters.
Yeah. Meeting you is the good.
Dude, that's my mom.
I just feel as if this would work a lot better as a two-parter, so that we could better understand the Secret Saturdays universe. It's just too much information to shove into a 22-minute episode. That's why Heroes United works so well, because it's basically 2 episodes in one. Though, this is partly the fault of the network just not wanting to promote this episode. But this is the highest I can put it. This episode makes absolutely no sense when trying to fit it into the classic series plot, and that is from Hedorium to Eternity. Now, not only does this have the Omniverse favorite retcons, but it also does the thing where it makes the classic series feel less special. Remember when the Null Void was like super jail? Once you're in, you can't get out, and you can't go into the Null Void without a flight suit, a GPS system, and a chain holding you back to Earth. Or superpowers. But here we see Kevin 11 just swinging around the Null Void like it's a kite. This episode also suffers from PSC, pointless side characters. Jonesy adds literally nothing to the story. I don't like Cooper in this episode. Just because he's good with technology doesn't mean he has to turn into Brainstorm. But yeah, despite the fact that it makes no sense for Kevin to be here, I somewhat still like this episode. Maybe because I watched it a lot when I was younger, or I just really like the scare. This episode kinda works, and I like that Lucy comes back. She's a cool character and I enjoy whenever she's on screen. I also like that the adults in town are gone, so it forces the kids to work on their own. Though saying that out loud makes this episode sound really similar to Permanent Retirement. Though the stuff with Mr. Bauman is pretty funny. Overall, this doesn't make sense at all, but it's still a decent watch. Next up is the return of the laughing, life-leeching lunatic himself, Zombozo, in Something Zombozo This Way Comes. This episode's just fine. I don't really have a lot of thoughts on it. We get the return of Zombozo and the Circus Freaks in a very classic series style plot, as this episode does tie into the classic series a bit, bringing back Ben's fear of clowns. And we do get to see aliens that we don't see a lot in Omniverse, such as Upgrade and Frankenstrike. This episode is just fine. Not bad, not great, it's just there. Taking a step away from Omniverse and going to an episode that did nothing but raise a lot of questions is the Transmogrification of Eunice. Now this episode is helped a little bit by the bias I have towards it, because it was one of the first episodes I watched a lot when I was younger, though I'll still try to rank it as critically as possible. This episode introduces some new concepts and explores the lore of the Omnitrix a bit more, as we get introduced to the character Eunice and the Unitrix, which is the prototype model from the Omnitrix, and Azimuth has hired Sunder to go get it for him. Let me just say this, I love Sunder's voice. He's voiced by Powers Booth, and he's actually the only character he voices in the entire franchise across Alien Force, Ultimate Alien, and Omniverse. It fits really well with his character and makes him sound like Norman Osborn from Spectacular Spider-Man.
You tried that move the last time, or have you forgotten?
I called you a buzzard! What? You can't even get the name right.
Which is pretty fitting since Sunder is basically just the Grey Goblin of Ben 10. I mean, he flies on a hoverboard and everything. The rest of this episode is actually pretty solid, especially the visuals and the mix of day and night shots. Where this episode kinda swerves though is Ben's character, and the return of him being a bad boyfriend. Him essentially cheating on Julie and claiming that they're already broken up.
What about Julie?
She was only a little too good looking for me. Julie broke up with me.
No, she said you might as well be broken up.
And also when we find out that Eunice is basically Ben's relative, and he spent the whole episode trying to get with her, since she was created by randomly sampling Gwen's DNA. They then try to fix this later on by addressing her as his family, but at this point, the damage was already done. Look, just like how Kanye said,
He kissed his sister!
Overall, this episode is still solid and has some decent visuals and fight scenes. Going back to Omniverse for this next episode, we have Food Around the Corner. This episode has a great concept and I like a lot of things in this episode, mainly the return and the development of the Lowoden and Apoplexian conflict. It's very interesting to see the lore between alien relationships, and the return of the Lowodens. I also like that we get the return of more things that the Omnitrix can do, such as the Lifeform Lock. And the fact that Ben is stuck as Gravitac for the entire episode because Galeans are very peaceful creatures is such a cool thing that they included. The problem with this episode is the Hulex. I don't like them. I think they're annoying and they could have been replaced by something else. I like this episode, but the Hulex just take it down for me. Also, with this episode being at the number 10 spot, it means two things. The first thing is that we've entered the top 10, and the second thing is that 6 of the 8 Omniverse premieres have already been mentioned on this list. But I think that makes sense, considering that Omniverse had 8 seasons and the only ones that had a really long-lasting plot was season 1 and 2. Which is conveniently the last premieres that we have to cover. And it's also the only 2 seasons that Dwayne McDuffie had a part in writing. Finally, we have an episode that's actually important to the Ben 10 story, and that is Truth. This episode introduces the Plumbers, and it's basically Secrets Part 2, and as I mentioned before, you can't really skip this episode. It starts off with Max explaining to the kids what the Plumbers are. Then we're introduced to Phil Billings, one of Max's many old partners. They bond after reuniting, and Phil explains that he's doing some alien extermination work. It turns out that Phil is actually releasing these aliens himself and getting people to pay him to get rid of them. How is he releasing these aliens? The null void projector, of course. Yeah, so what some people don't know is that this is actually the episode to introduce the concept of the null void. Some people think it's back with a vengeance, but nope, it's actually here. This episode is this high mainly just because of how important it is. And it's also just a good episode. Phil is a great character, seeing all the released aliens are cool, and it's a nice explanation going from the finale. It's rare that we get something like this. Overall, it's a good watch, but it's more the information that it gives you. This next one is the first pilot episode of the list, and that is Fame. I really like this episode for multiple reasons. The first one is that it just jumps straight into the story. It kicks off the Andromeda 5 alien arc, which is an arc that I enjoy very much. It introduces the characters very well, such as Will Harang. This man is just an insane news reporter who just loves to spend his days ripping into this 16-year-old. Just because he's a hater. And I gotta respect him for that.
Unbelievably, some people defend the actions of Tennyson, claiming he's some kind of superhero. Obviously ridiculous.
We also get Jimmy Jones, who was pretty much all of us as a kid. I say that, but I'm still a kid. I love his knockoff Ben 10 hoodie, and I love that he's the one who leaked Ben's identity all over the internet, because it makes sense. We also get Bivalven and a little taste of Agrigor at the end of it. Plus, the plot of this episode is pretty good, and I like how it jumps straight into the season arc. And while I like this episode with my current knowledge of the series, I can't help but think that you'll be pretty confused if this is the first episode of Ben 10 you watched. I feel like Alien Force and Omniverse pilots are still understandable if they're your gateway into the series, but Fame doesn't really give you that same level of introduction. Although, you shouldn't really be watching Ultimate Alien as your gateway into the series anyways. It's basically Alien Force Part 2. But overall, still a good watch, still a good premiere. Another pilot episode is up, and that is the More Things Change Part 1 and 2. This is a great start to Omniverse, and it really shows off Omniverse's new concepts, characters, and stories in a fantastic looking way. I mean that because of Omniverse's animation and visuals. It's almost mesmerizing how good this show looks. And yeah, there are a lot of square patterns in Omniverse. In pretty much every frame, there is a square pattern. Like seriously, go on the Ben 10 wiki and just look at the frames of these episodes. It's everywhere. But despite that, it's still so beautiful. Especially with the character design. Hot take, I actually kind of like Kaiba, and I'm a fan of his design and I think he looks cool. And also the Nematrix with all of its predators look incredible, and it's such a cool concept. This episode also introduces Rook Blanco, which is one of the best things that Omniverse ever created. Oh yeah, and we get malware and feedback at the start of the episode. My main gripe with this episode is that it tries to tackle a little bit too many stories at once. I like Kyber and the Predator stuff, and it's cool that we get a little taste of malware at this point. But I find the inclusion of the Undertown security gang run by Siphon to be a little bit redundant. And the characters do return, but it's a little bit filler feeling. Although this does give an interesting comparison between Kyber and Siphon, as Ben thinks they're all connected. Overall, it's a great two-parter and a great introduction to Omniverse. Coming into the top 5 and the last episode for Omniverse is Many Happy Returns. This episode works so well as a season 2 premiere, but it works better after watching all of season 1. Don't get me wrong, this episode is still great, but it gets better once you understand what makes this episode so special. The reason why this is so good is because Gwen and Kevin come back. But something this episode introduces rather than bringing back was the Tetramans and the Chorus Empire. We get Luma and Gar Redwind, who are just great characters in this episode. I specify in this episode because of what I had to witness earlier. The plot of this episode is just great, and I love the idea of alien marriage laws being a problem that the crew has to deal with. Kevin got mixed up with the Tetraman marriage laws when he was a young boy and ended up getting engaged to Princess Luma so he could get an engine block. And then he left her straight after. Classic Kevin. Why have women when you can have a car? No, wait, that was a joke, No. But yeah, Kevin ditches Luma and now she's back to claim him. But obviously Kevin doesn't want to go. Ben steps in and defeats Luma, leaving Ben to be her betrothed. This is a very interesting plot point, but come on Ben, you should have just left with Luma. You'll have the entire Tetraman army on your side, a rich father-in-law, And the Frogs of War basically would not have even happened if you had this whole army. Luma's subsequent appearances though I feel just get worse and worse, but this episode's still a banger, so that's why it's number 5. Finally going back to Alien Force for this next pick is Ben 10 Returns Part 1 and 2. Yup, the premiere mistaken for an episode of Batman because of how dark it is the entire time. Like come on, they are literally sitting in a black void. Nah, but aside from this episode suffering from a case of void rage, it's actually a great start to the series. We get a nice introduction to Ben, Gwen, and Kevin's new characters, now being 5 years older and being completely different from their classic series versions. Ben is mature and living a great life, playing soccer and getting girls. Gwen is also more mature and now has a karate black belt, and Kevin makes his introduction here, solidifying himself as the best character in the series. Oh yeah, and the scene when the Omnitrix recalibrates is probably one of the most watched series in the entire franchise, as the Omnitrix upgrades itself, fixing all of the issues it had before, so no more mistransformations. Until we get to Vengeance of Vilgax. Then they break the Omnitrix again, and now it's back to being busted. But look, for 2 seasons we got a goated Omnitrix. It was like going from Windows 8 to Windows 10. Windows 8 was dark times. Magister Labrid gets introduced in this episode, and then dies in the next one. But I love how the scene was played so straight, and I like that that's the reason why Kevin joins the trio. It makes it more believable after seeing Labrid pass away. Another thing I like about this episode is that it jumps straight into the season plot, and shows us that this show is meant to be about mystery. If you guys didn't know, Alien Force is actually meant to be very mystery centered, akin to a show like Stranger Things, until the network stepped in and said, no, we want to sell toys. So Alien Force could have been a completely different show from what it was now. I recommend checking out these videos from the Ink Tank if you want to see what it could have been. I love Alien Force, and this premiere still slaps, even in the darkness. Number 3 on my list and the last episode from Ultimate Alien is Map of Infinity. This episode kicks off the Map of Infinity arc, and it kicks it off fantastically. It's basically just part 2 for Ultimate Aggregor, and starts off immediately after that episode ends. We see Ben go absolutely ballistic on Aggregor, since he's basically just killed the 5 aliens that the trio spent a whole season trying to save. But then Aggregor has an anime villain moment and says that all Ben did meant nothing to him.
What he did, I lost my... Is that the best you can do? Because I didn't feel a thing.
And then proceeds to absolutely rock him. Then we get introduced to the Map of Infinity, Max becomes disabled. So much has happened in this episode, and only 9 minutes have gone by. The second half of this episode is the trio traveling to McDilty to find the first map piece. This place is straight up awesome. It's a half cold, half hot planet inhabited by necrophrygians, which makes sense because they're impervious to temperatures. They go through a temple which is littered with traps, but Aggregor ends up with a map piece by the end of it, but it sets the tone for the season arc. The visuals in this episode are great. I mean, a large portion of this episode just has Ben as Ultimate Echo Echo, which is a huge plus. And the temple, while simple, is still a really sick place. This episode is fantastic, and it shows you how to put multiple things in just 20 minutes. Looking at you, Vengeance of Vilgax. Number 2 is technically number 1, as it was the first episode of Ben 10. This is the premiere of the premieres and the start of the franchise. I'm sure you know what it is. Number 2 on the list is And Then There Were 10. I just absolutely love this episode. There's something about it that just makes it so charming. We get introduced to Ben, Gwen, Max, Vilgax, and the Omnitrix. I'm pretty sure every Ben 10 fan can recite the scene when Ben first found the Omnitrix. And I'm sure every fan just wished that an Omnitrix would land in their backyard every day. I know I did. They made the Omnitrix look so cool and made me want to live in the Ben 10 universe. We get 4 iconic transformations in episode 1, the third one being obviously the best transformation that Ben has ever used.
So what can this guy do?
I don't know, but I bet it's gonna be cool.
We also get a little intro to Vilgax at the start of the episode, setting him up to be the season-long villain. It introduces the concept of aliens fantastically, and it's the perfect window into the Ben 10 universe. I've talked about this episode before, and I may talk about it some more in a future video that's probably going to come out in the next few weeks. So I'll leave it at that. But just know, I love this episode, but not more than our number 1 spot, which is... And the final and best episode from this video comes from Alien Force. The number 1 spot for this probably very long video is Alone Together, the season 2 premiere. Now some people say this is actually not the premiere and it's actually Dark Star Rising, considering that this episode aired after Dark Star Rising, but I believe this is the premiere because of what the wiki says, and it just makes more sense for the premiere. But anyways, I love this episode. I've said that a lot in this video, but I actually mean it here. This is one of the most feel-good episodes ever. The more this episode goes on, the more you start to really fall in love with Ben's characterization. If you're still one of the people who believe that Alien Force Season 1 and 2 Ben is boring, I implore you to watch this episode. In this episode, we follow Ben and a hybrid called Riney as they are trapped in a desert planet and have to work together to make their way out. I love this episode because it progresses the hybrid in a new way. That's not just the trio fighting endless mobs of DNA aliens. And yes, this episode is actually very important to the hybrid arc, since Riney is basically the person who convinces the Supreme Hybrid Council to, not genocide the whole universe. And it gives more depth to the season antagonist, making him not so one-dimensional. We saw Riney as a very one-dimensional character at the start of the episode, but by the end of it, we learned that hybrids are actually able to empathize and have human emotions. Villains are better characters when you can see their perspectives. The visuals in this episode are great, and the desert looks very interesting at both day and night. And we get cool native aliens that Ben and Riney have got to fight. And some of Ben's abilities get expanded on, like Echo Echo's echolocation and Swampfire's regeneration on other people. Also, this is some of the best character work we've seen out of Ben, being the most mature hero he's ever been.
It was in my own interest to stop that creature from harming you.
Well, it's in my interest to help anybody who needs it.
Overall, this is a fantastic episode and my personal #1 premiere. And that is it. We finally ranked not only every pilot episode, but every season premiere. This is probably a very long video, so if you made it to the end and you're watching me right now, comment down below your favorite and least favorite season premiere. Remember that all these premieres were chosen based off of the wiki, and also what mainly just makes the most sense. But thank you if you watched this video this far, leave your thoughts on the list down below, and if this video does well, then I will drop a video ranking every single season finale. But that one is going to be a little longer of a wait. But that's all I've got to say for now. Like and subscribe, follow me on Instagram, and I'm Rizzyrez, and until next time, I'll see you later, peace.